Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Our next presenter is probably the most talked about deposit in recent years for our community, because you think of Timmins, you think of gold. You think of base metal finds like when I worked there, a place called Texas Gulf. But now we have an extraordinarily promising opportunity on the horizon. So it gives me great pleasure today to introduce Mark Selby. He's the Chairman, CEO, and Director of Canada Nickel. Mark will be speaking about advancing the next generation of high-quality, high-potential nickel-cobalt projects to deliver the metals needed to power the electrical vehicle revolution and feed the high-growth stainless steel markets. Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity today. Set my timer so I don't go too long. We're advancing the Crawford Nickel-Sulphide Project. It was a discovery made in 2019. By the end of this year, we'll have a feasibility study done, and we're rapidly advancing it into production. Earlier this year, we had an announcement out just this past week. As exciting as Crawford is, which is the largest nickel sulfide discovery since the early 1970s, we believe we're on the verge of unlocking an entire nickel district here in Timmins. We picked up 2 other properties yesterday, and we think we're going to find another half a dozen Crawfords in this region and turn Timmins into one of the most important nickel-producing regions, not only in Canada, but around the world. Part of the reason we're aggressively advancing this project is the nickel market desperately needs new nickel projects, particularly in places like North America. We need to double nickel supply by the end of this decade, as the continued growth from stainless steel, which has been the traditional market for nickel, has been joined by a massive new surge of demand for electric vehicles. Nickel is the metal that gives electric vehicles the range and the power they need. So, if you look at all the Ford Explorer, the big pickup trucks, the sports cars that the North American car makers are converting to electric vehicle platforms first, there's going to be a pile of nickel sitting in the bottom of every one of those cars. And there's some real challenges in nickel supply globally. Most of the growth over the last 6 years has come from Indonesia by Chinese-controlled companies, and they today dominate more than 2/3 of global supply. The other big issue, all that nickel comes with a massive carbon footprint. They're generating anywhere from 30 to 80 tons of CO2 per ton of nickel. When Elon Musk set out to try and decarbonize transportation, having to go buy a bunch of really dirty nickel from Indonesia was not the way he thought he was going to have to go about it. So we've got a very unique opportunity with Crawford. It's a type of nickel deposit called ultramafic. I'm not going to get into any more technical detail than that, but the great thing about it is the rock that hosts these deposits, when it's exposed to air, it spontaneously absorbs CO2. So that, in combination of being in a great location like we are here in Timmins, with all the major infrastructure in place, with 80,000 people who live within an hour's drive of the project, and access to low carbon electricity from the grid, we believe we can bring all this nickel production on and not only have it be low carbon, but actually zero carbon with a whole stream of carbon credits, and provide a foundation for a whole zero carbon industrial cluster here in Timmins. So I'll talk a bit about more in all of this in a little more detail as we go through the slides. In terms of nickel production, just very simply, we need to find as much nickel this decade as was producing in 2020. So we need to find another Sudbury, another Norilsk, another set of mines in Western Australia, the equivalent of all that, and have it in production by 2030, just to have enough nickel for the electric vehicle market. And there's projections that are much larger than that in terms of how much nickel the battery market will ultimately need. In terms of supply concentration, before gas prices got this high, the last time they were like this was in the early 1970s, when OPEC decided to flex its muscle in the oil space, and we saw what happened with oil prices back in that time. Well, today, in the nickel space, I know we think of Sudbury being all about nickel, but the sad part is Canada produces less than 5% of the world's nickel today. it is dominated by just 3 countries: Indonesia, Philippines, and Russia. And so, with the war in Ukraine, that caused a further disruption to a very tight nickel market earlier this year. And the main commodity market where nickel trades is the London Metal Exchange. And the market actually stopped trading for a week because it was so out of balance. These 3 countries, they've intervened in the mining sector. They're short of cash. And so, again, car companies are not going to bet, their entire businesses on trying to get supply from here. So a project like ours, that's basically a 15-hour drive from most of the North American auto production, is going to be an ideal source of supply for these industries. As exciting as about how much nickel is there, what I tell investors all the time is what a great location we have here in Timmins. You've got all the major infrastructure that you need to build a mine, right by the mine site: power, rail, road. You've got 80,000 people who live within an hour's drive of the mine site, so we can have a workforce that can drive in and drive out. And as a number of people pointed out, the problem with a fly-in, fly-out mine is when people come in to the airport to fly out to where they're going, that community doesn't get the benefits. But when people can reside and live, and actually, again, we're going to be building a mine that will hopefully last for many, many decades. It's the kind of thing that really helps, kind of project that helps build communities. We've been working with the local First Nations here from day one, and again, in this area where there's so much mining activity, they understand the benefits of the cost and benefits of mining activity, and we've got a great relationship with the 3 groups that we work with primarily in the area. In terms of the scale that we're building, we put out a PEA, which is the first engineering study on the project, about a year ago, and very happy with the results. Over $1 billion NPV. We'll be producing 40,000 tons of nickel a year, and again, producing for 25 years. Cash costs in a low quartile, and again, of the scale that will matter to an automaker, an EV supply chain participant who wants a long life, large scale source of supply. In terms of a bunch of the key metrics that investors look at, we sit very favorably. We're in the lowest quartile of the cash cost curve. We're in the lowest decile of the carbon curve, and this number does not include the benefit of our tailings and waste rock absorbing carbon. Again, with that additional benefit, we think we'll get to a point where we're 0 and actually have carbon credits available for sale. In terms of the scale of what we're building, when we're fully ramped up, we would be the 5th largest nickel sulfide operation globally, just behind Vale and Selby. I'm hoping by the time we get our feasibility study done, we'll be in a place where we'll be in 4th place overall. And again, a number of those larger operations are actually multi-mine operations. We're going to be one big open pit operation delivering all that nickel. In terms of base metal mines, this would be the largest base metal operation in Canada. So larger than Highland Valley with Teck, larger than Raglan up in Quebec, and larger than Voisey's Bay. So again, of the scale, that is going to attract the kind of investors and partners that will allow this project to actually get built. We've been advancing this very aggressively, so typically when you see a PEA from a junior miner, that's the best number, and as they do more work, the value goes down. We started very early in the process, and so we actually have a number of significant value improvements that are going to be baked into the feasibility study that's coming at the end of the year. We cut the resource off over a year ago at hole 65. Today, I think at Crawford, we're at hole 250. And so we're delivering a resource that's 50 to 100% larger in the feasibility study. We'll be targeting 1.3 to 1.8 billion tons of ore in a mine plan out of a resource base that will likely exceed over 2 billion tons. In terms of recovery improvement, we've done less than a year's worth of metallurgy work on these deposits, and these deposits do require a little fine-tuning with each one. And so, we've been able to unlock a series of improvements that we think will deliver 4 to 5 percentage points of improvement, with each one of those percentage points adding $90 million of NPV to the project. We're doing work on larger and larger samples to quantify exactly how much carbon our tailings and waste rock can capture. You start at a very small lab scale and ramp up from there. And in our PEA, we assumed everything would go into the stainless steel industry that does not pay for the cobalt and PGMs that are sitting in the concentrate. But in the feasibility study, we'll have a good chunk of the nickel going to the EV market, and that cobalt and PGMs that are sitting there, palladium, platinum, will become payable. In terms of carbon footprint, just to give you an idea of just how spontaneous this process is, if you look at the two pictures on the right-hand side of the screen, the rock, when it comes out of the ground, is dark black to dark green. Within a year, like the piece of core in the bottom of that photo, it has this white coating over all of the surface of that rock. That white coating is a mineral called magnesite. It's a magnesium carbonate mineral, and how it gets there is the dark magnesium silicate minerals you see there reach out to the environment, grab a CO2 molecule, and spontaneously convert themselves to that magnesite mineral, permanently sequestering the carbon. So, in a world today that's trying to find ways to take carbon out of the environment, the property of this material and the fact that we're going to grind it up in a bunch of very fine particles to pull the nickel out, is going to be very valuable to our project and have value, again, we think as a potential anchor for a zero carbon industrial cluster here in the Timmins area. In terms of First Nations agreement, we put in place, we think, groundbreaking impact assessment process agreements to have them, a step up more in terms of it being involved in developing the environmental impact statement, which we expect to file sometime next year. You can see from the quotes here, they're happy with our team, the project, and our approach. And again, we're really looking forward to working together for many, many decades. In terms of timeline, so we started with hole 5 with this project back in September 2019. We completed the PEA last year. We'll have the feasibility study done at the end of this year. We filed the initial project description, which kicks off the permitting process, and we'll be filing the final version of that in July. We're expecting 3 years to get all our permits, so we'll get them sometime in mid-2025. It'll be 2 years of construction, and we hope we'll be operating for a good 40 years plus into the future. So that's just Crawford in terms of what we're doing there. And about just over a year ago, we realized these types of deposits have a very distinct geophysical footprint. So we thought before everybody figures out the value of what we have, we should make sure there's nothing else around Timmins that might be valuable. And so our team was involved with the Dumont project across the border in Quebec. That's where we figured out how valuable the geophysics can be. And so we used Dumont as an anchor in the regional geophysics, and we used Crawford and to tune the map into a certain range. And we knew with Dumont, there was nothing around it for 40 kilometers. It was very actively explored in the late 60s, early 70s. But what was amazing to us is about 20 different targets lit up around the Timmins camp. And what was even more surprising is when we started then to go into the Ontario Geological database, where all the previous work had been done, and we go back to the 50s and 60s and 80s and 90s. And sure enough, there's all kinds of drilling that was done that describes serpentinized dunite with lots of visible magnetite and talk of fine disseminated sulfides, which is exactly what we're looking for. So we did 18 transactions in the second half of last year to pick up 13 properties. We've now picked up a few more that we just announced. We had 6 of them what we're calling uncoveries, that some of those historic drill holes, if we release them today, we would count as a interesting new discovery. We've got some other targets that are multiple of the size that we already have with Crawford, and have been largely untested. And our first holes in the Reed deposit, which is in the second bullet point there, we hit the kind of mineralization that we're looking for, from the top to the bottom of the hole, with 80 meters of pretty decent mineralization. You can see a chunk of it in our booth on the floor. So again, we think this area will end up delivering at least a half a dozen Crawfords, and again become one of the major nickel districts globally. This picture here, anything that's pink is the right kind of geophysical footprint we're looking for, so you can see the scale of some of the targets that we're looking at. Now, some people might think, oh, geez, Selby's always waving his arms, and how can he really wave his arms about a big nickel district already? But the reality of the geology of nickel is you need a rip in the Earth's crust to let material from the mantle get high enough up that it eventually becomes exposed and that you're able to mine it. Those rips sometimes are one-offs, but in a lot of cases end up being big structures where you have multiple deposits along it. And so, again, what we think here is, we've uncovered a series of rips around Timmins, and that are going to have a cluster of nickel deposits to rival the half a dozen largest regions in the world that produce, more than 2/3 of the nickel that we know. Even more so, because this nickel in a place like Timmins can be delivered in a low carbon way, and again, with the magic ability of this rock to spontaneously absorb carbon, we think that this is going to become the premier source of nickel for the EV market in North America and Europe going forward. We're going to be talking a lot to the community. Our team's been here and has been out with the earliest phases of the consultation process with the initial project description, and as we go through the permitting process, we're going to be seeing a lot of us to make sure that you're as fully informed as possible as we pull the project forward. There's been a huge amount of corporate activity in the space. For those of you who are Noront shareholders and watch the price get bid up by a factor of 10x, the majors are paying attention to nickel sulfide deposits, and again, we expect to see a lot of interest in the company over the coming years. In terms of those of you who are looking to add to their portfolio, and if you looked at, our share price is up 8x in 2 years, but we think there's a huge amount of upside that you can see from this chart here in terms of being valued relative to some of our peers. So, again, we think the nickel market is going to be entering one of these super cycles that it goes through. We went through one in the late 60s, another one in the late 80s, another one in the mid 2000s, and again, the strong demand from the EV market is going to propel us into a new one over the next 2 to 3 years. Nickel supply growth has been really challenged. It's been so concentrated in Indonesia and China. China effectively controls 60% of global nickel supply. And again, most of the nickel growth has come from very high carbon nickel production in Indonesia. This is the biggest sulfide discovery since the early 70s, just with Crawford. And again, we're going to continue to expand it into what we think is a multi-Crawford big Timmins nickel district. And our company, with our team and our experience, and a number of our team are here today, you can get this project through permitting into construction, and hopefully coming online by the later part of this decade. We're very blessed to be in a location that has the kind of infrastructure, mining experience, the fact that you've got 5,000 people and walking around those two arenas, you can not only get everything you need to build a mine, but everything you need to operate a mine, pretty much within these set of walls over these last few days. We completed the financing. We raised $50 million in March. We've started on our permitting journey. We'll have a resource update out at the end of the quarter. We'll have our feasibility study completed by the end of the year. And again, look for those district-wide exploration announcements as we step around those other properties and start to prove out what we think is going to be a great nickel district. So thanks for your time. I'll be glad to answer any questions.